Welcome to Ace of Pentacles, your career strategy and workplace wellness podcast. I'm your host, Sara, and I'm so happy you're here. Join me every week as we investigate how people design and discover their way through their careers. Together, we'll explore the science of well-being at work and discover tools and strategies to help us do well and be well. Today, you'll meet Niharika Ray. Niharika is the Chief Operating Officer of Minds Matter Bay Area, an educational nonprofit. A few years ago, Niharika made a significant change in her career story. I wanted us to learn more about how she made that change because it's something I see many people wrestle with. A lot of us have jobs where we have great pay and amazing benefits, and the teams we work with are really great, but the work itself might not be as impactful or fulfilling as we would like. In this conversation, Niharika walks us through her decision to leave her role as Senior Software Engineer at Airbnb to work full-time for the nonprofit she originally joined as a volunteer. What becomes clear is Niharika's ability to tune into her intuition and then do the hard work, the strategic work, crunching the numbers, looking at the data, to make sense of the intuitive direction that she is drawn to. If you're contemplating a career move, you might find some really great advice in this episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Niharika Ray.
Niharika, hi.
Hello. Good afternoon.
How are you?
Good.
Yeah.
It's Thursday? We're on Thursday.
We're on Thursday.
Almost Friday.
Almost Friday, yes, that's true. Thank you for the reminder. You and I volunteered at Minds Matter for several years together, and one of the things I really remember about you that, has just stayed with me and the way that you've been so memorable to me is you always showed up like 100%. And I was so impressed with this. And you had these really amazing leadership qualities. And I remember us having these really amazing conversations about work and the meaning of work and how we make sense of it. And it was especially relevant because you were working at Airbnb and I had a full-time job. I think I was working at Square at the time. And we were both also volunteering. And then a few years later, I saw that you left your Airbnb job and you started full-time at Minds Matter as your second full-time staff member. And I think a lot of people dream a little bit about wanting to leave these corporate careers and get off the, out of the rat race and go do something more meaningful, more aligned, however you want to explain that. But they don't, and you did.
Accurate. Also accurate.
And I want to dig into that a little bit today.
Sure.
I want to learn about what your decision-making process was, what your thought process was, what were the things that were driving you, and how this made sense in terms of your career and the way you see yourself and your professional identity.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great. I'm excited for our conversation. So let's start here. Who is Niharika? Tell us a little bit about you.
I actually really dislike this question, but I will answer. I'm going to say a bunch of things before I answer this question. First of all, thank you for having me, Sara. It's always a pleasure to chat. I remember when we met. Oh God, definitely pre-pandemic and all the years kind of blur together before that. But I remember when we met, I think we were doing a program leadership team kickoff before the school year started. And I just remember, I think how warm you were. I think your co-lead was very all business and getting things done, which was important. And you were much more the people person and asking us, why we were there, what sort of impact we were hoping to have. And I think that's probably influenced my leadership quite a bit. And we can talk about that too. So thank you for having me on the show. Excited to always chat. Thank you for also talking about the way that I showed up. I think this is something that I didn't think was super important. I assumed that everybody showed up, but I think over the years, that's something that people have said to me, and I think I'm starting to believe it a little bit more. People have said a variety of things, both good and bad, but one of the things they've always said is you're always there, and we know that you were always there, and I didn't realize how important that was, I think, until I really transitioned into the nonprofit volunteer space, so thank you also for the compliment. Okay, to answer your question. This is actually a really hard question for me to answer, and the reason for this is, for a long time when people asked me who I was, I would say, oh, my name is Niharika, I'm a software engineer at Airbnb. This kind of made sense. I was a software engineer for 7 years. My degree is in, computer science. And so I had tied a lot of my identity to being a software engineer. I am no longer a software engineer. And so when people ask me this question, I think I hesitate a little bit to say like, okay, well, who am I, right? Because I don't want to answer this question as like, I am my career, even though I love my job. But I will start that way because I haven't crafted a better answer yet. So I'm Niharika. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Minds Matter Bay Area. I've been full-time since January 2022, so I think it's about 3 years, almost coming up to 3 years now. I think my job has changed every year since I've had it, so we'll see what my title and my job is next year. Stay tuned. Outside of work, though, I would say that I really enjoy reading. I think I'm coming back into it. I think for a while I was like, reading is fine. But there's a ton of really great books, a lot of great fiction. So I've been enjoying reading, and I've played piano for years, so I also do that. But my proudest accomplishment to date happened very recently. My family's not athletic. Sorry, family, if you're listening to this. Like, we don't run, we don't hike. Like, I grew up in the suburbs of Jersey. Our idea of a Saturday was going to the mall and walking around the mall. But I've convinced my entire family to sign up for a turkey trot over Thanksgiving. So I'm also running to get ready for this turkey trot.
Oh my gosh. Wait, Niharika, walking around the mall is not a hike?
No.
Just to be okay.
Apparently not to California people, but California people are like, we're going on a hike. They're like, it's like there's mountains involved.
All right, Niharika, you started at Minds Matter Bay when it was Minds Matter San Francisco back in 2016. Tell me a little bit about why you started volunteering.
Yes, this is also a good story. I think it's a good story. So I had moved out to San Francisco, let's say March 2015, I think was right. And I had always enjoyed teaching. So like in high school, I was also part of a tutoring org. I was a TA in college. But obviously, I think like for a lot of people, when you first move out to a new city, and you're also like a real adult for the first time, volunteering is maybe not top of mind. And so I spent a couple months at the job at Airbnb, and then I was like, okay, let me start volunteering somewhere. And it actually wasn't Minds Matter. It was actually a different org working with middle schoolers, and it was lovely. But I think middle schoolers are just like a really hard age range. I think middle schoolers are going through a lot, and so I don't know that it was totally for me. And so I was volunteering, and I enjoyed going. I think it was every Wednesday, but I was probably looking for a change in that space. And actually, at the same time, I was also a little bit unhappy at my job. I think this is probably also true for a lot of people their first year is you're maybe a little bit disillusioned, like corporate life is maybe not what you think it is, maybe you have different expectations of your job. I certainly did. And so, this all sort of culminates into me being like, maybe I should quit my job and become a teacher. At the time, I actually had a friend who had gone through Teach for America, and so like all good friends will do, they were like, sure, you should apply, it'll be great. And so I actually applied to Teach for America, sort of made it through to the final round interviews, and then got rejected. And I was heartbroken. I was like, what am I going to do with my life? Like, I don't know, like, who am I, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so said friend, seeing how dejected I was, he was like, okay, listen, I'm actually volunteering with an org called Minds Matter San Francisco. A lot of my ex-TFA friends have actually volunteered for Minds Matter in other cities. And so why don't you just come join me and like you can teach on the side. And that is how I ended up at Minds Matter San Francisco. And it's been, obviously like I was really upset about being rejected from TFA, but it's been, I think, probably the biggest blessing in disguise. And that's how I started in 2016.
Oh, yeah. I have a lot of stories of blessings in disguise as it relates to careers. I'm sure you do too. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I actually have a similar story with Minds Matter. I was working at Tesla in sales, and I was like, I really need to go back to teaching. I really need to do something meaneful, different. Like, not that selling cars. People need cars. Selling cars is great.
We have a Tesla, so yes, thank you for doing your job. Yeah.
You're welcome. But I think a lot of people that came to Minds Matter came with that mindset of like, okay, I have this job, and Minds Matter is this organization that brings these professionals, these really high achieving professionals in the Bay Area, especially, into the space where they're mentoring and they're helping, essentially shape these children's futures. And I think it's a beautiful mission, but I think it attracts that type of person who's kind of like, I'm in this corporate career and I think this is what I thought this is what I wanted, but now I want to do something else. When you started at Minds Matter, did you think that was one of your goals to move into a nonprofit leadership role full time?
Absolutely not. First of all, I actually don't think I knew that what kind of roles in nonprofit leadership look like. I think when I started, and certainly when you were early days of Minds Matter, we didn't have a CEO, right? Like, this was an entirely volunteer run, and so even our volunteer CEO, I was like, well, I don't want that because that sounds like a lot of work. And so I don't think I had an idea of what a career in nonprofit looked like. And then of course, I wasn't constantly unhappy at my job. And so there were definitely a lot of years at Airbnb that I was very, very happy. And so I always thought that, after Airbnb, whenever that might be, I would just hop to another really mission-driven tech company, maybe in the ed tech space, but I hadn't really, considered it. So any career outside of tech, I think, was just not even on the horizon.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you had no idea about nonprofit careers, and it feels like very much like your career now found you.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. To be clear, I still don't know what a career in nonprofit looks like. I'm only 3 years into this gig, but I think that's 100%. I don't know, and obviously happy to chat about this further, but I don't know that I would have gone seeking another opportunity, and I think a lot of that is also just given my personality type and given I think the way I think about leadership. I don't even know that I would have gone to another nonprofit that I hadn't already been a part of as a volunteer. But we can get to it.
Okay, great, yeah. Did anything about making this decision scare you?
Oh my God, all of it. Literally all of it. There was no part of it that was not scary. I think there were probably a couple of axes that were tricky. I think, first and foremost, I think when you say you're a software engineer at Airbnb, everybody knows what that means. Everybody can kind of guess what you do. But when you say when you start saying oh, I'm the chief operating officer at a nonprofit, everybody's like, what do you do? And so I think for me, perhaps the scariest part of that whole decision was actually maybe the emotional transition of losing that identity as a software engineer, and then even parts of that job. So at Minds Matter, we have a leadership team called steering. Sara was on steering, I was on steering, we were on the same steering for a year, and what part of my responsibility was actually going to be leading the steering team that I was on. So if you can imagine, I was on a team of, with 7 other people. We were a team of 8. And suddenly I'm being pulled out of this friend group effectively to lead this friend group. I think that was also really tricky. So there was the emotional part around my identity, but there was also the emotional part about okay, now I'm leading a group of people who were my friends. And that's a very different dynamic. I will also say that again, I didn't know what this meant. And so I have no idea and I think time will tell, if this was the right career move or not. But when I was making this decision, I was will this work? What if I decide to work full time at something that I love as a volunteer and then I hate it? Now I've lost 2 things. 1, I've lost my job, but 2, I've also lost the thing that brought me joy. So I think there was some questions around how am I going to feel about this whole thing? And then I think this is really boring and tactical, but there was a lot of due diligence around money and finances, insurance, all of that quote unquote unfun stuff, but the important stuff that I think was also a little scary. So yes, this decision was entirely scary.
Yeah.
I don't know why I said yes. I'm glad I did, but I don't know why.
You don't know why you said yes. Okay. I want to dig into that a little bit. Okay, so you're making this decision, and it's clearly a really big career decision. When you think about that moment in your life, what were the considerations? Were there people that helped guide that? Were there experiences that helped guide that? If you could point out 3 or 4 or maybe even less moments where you were kind of moved in a certain direction, what was that like for you?
Yes. I think there were probably 3 specific things. I will start off by saying I'm really stubborn. So if anyone, I was going to be the only one to make this decision. Nobody was going to nudge me one way or the other. Probably much to the chagrin of everybody involved that I talked to about this decision. So I think there were a couple things, and I'll actually take a step back and talk a little bit about my career at Airbnb. So I was a software engineer for nearly 7 years at Airbnb, but I was actually on 3 different teams during that time. So I started out on the data infrastructure team, sort of moved to production infrastructure, and then went to payments infrastructure. And you might ask, okay, you moved around every 2 years, why did you do that? And really the reason for that was at every point, when I was about to switch, I was okay, what am I trying to learn next? And so when I started out, I was first on data infrastructure. The team built tools for data scientists and internal folks. And so when I looked at that, I was okay, I feel I understand, kind of how to do this. I've sort of reached the limit of the things that I want to learn in this space. Not that there's not cooler things to learn in this space. And then I was okay, but the thing I want to learn is how do you run a production website, right? How do you run a website at scale? So then I hopped to the team that actually does that, production infrastructure. And so I did that for a couple of years. And then I was okay, I kind of understand how infrastructure works as much as I actually am passionate about this. Now I'm interested in like the intersection of like product and infrastructure, right? So you have all these product demands, you also have infrastructure demands, how do you bring them together? That brought me to payments infrastructure. And so at the end of my tenure at Airbnb, I was kind of in the same spot where I was like, is there something at Airbnb that I'm like really excited to learn? And Airbnbers, I love you. But at the time, I was like, not really. Like there were a lot of cool problems, there were still a lot of cool problems at Airbnb, but none that I was super passionate about solving. And then when this opportunity came up, when Irene, our CEO, came up and was like, hey, would you be interested? What I thought about was actually one of the biggest gaps in my skill set was how do you manage people? How do you lead people, right? I had never done that as an engineer. I was always an IC at Airbnb. And so to me, I was like, okay, this is actually like the next horizon. This may be inaccurate, but I would say that like actually managing at a nonprofit seems like managing it on hard mode because you don't have your traditional like carrot and stick, right? Not to say that good managers rely on that, but like that doesn't exist. And so long story short, I was like, okay, this seems like a cool problem. I have no experience in this. Like I would love to learn this. I happen to think Irene is very good at this, so I like get to learn from the best. So I would say like that was probably the big moment where I was like, okay, there is something here that I can learn. I would say the second piece was actually something really clever that Irene did, where she came to me and she was like, why don't you craft your own roadmap for the next 2 years? I will say that roadmap got thrown out the window in like the first 3 months, but what I think that was really brilliant for was it made me invested in the future of the org, and it allowed me to like sort of envision what I would be doing, because again, right, like I had no idea what being a nonprofit leader looks like, and so when I actually sat down and thought about it, right, and we reviewed it together before I said yes, as I was going through this process, I was like, oh, I'm now more and more invested. Like, I want to see this through, right? Like, I want to see us get better in X, Y, and Z spaces. So I think that would be like the next moment. But the third moment is the unfun stuff. Is basically I pulled out a spreadsheet and I like did the math on all of the things, like on my like salary, on my new salary, right? On how insurance would work, how all of these other things would work. And then when I did all the calculations, I was like, yeah, this seems like I could do it. And that was it. That was the yes.
Yeah.
So 3 things.
You started off by talking about, I was going to make this decision. Mm-hmm. And I think that's amazing. That's so empowering to hear that. Like, nobody else was going to make this decision for me. I was going to make it. Were there external influences? Were there people that were like, oh, what are you doing, you Airbnb engineer? Airbnb, Niharika.
Yeah, right. Like, how could you stop? Yeah. I mean, there certainly were. And I don't think... I love my parents, and so they also knew that they were like, I was going to be the only one to make this decision. But I think they also had some questions. They were like, do what you want, right? Like, it is your life, live your life. And also, have you thought it through? Which is why I made that spreadsheet, to be like, yes, I did think this through. I think, so obviously, Nick, my husband, this was something that we talked about. I think he also knows that I'm very stubborn, obviously. And so I think, but I wanted to talk to him about it because I think like working a nonprofit career is a little bit different than working your traditional 9 to 5. And then I obviously talked to my best friend. Her name is also Sara. But I don't know that there were a lot of people who like really pushed me in one way or the other. I think there were a lot of people who were maybe my sounding boards, but I think also the way I work is like after a certain point, I don't need a sounding board. Like I just need to like sit and think and let all the thoughts percolate. And so I did all the sounding board, gathered all the data, and then like eventually came to my own conclusion.
Niharika, what is the advice you would give to someone that is yearning for something different, something more meaningful, and maybe they are considering leaving a corporate career for something like a nonprofit? What's your advice for this person?
Oh man, I get asked this question a lot actually, because people are like, wow, how did you do this? I think I have like 2 pieces of advice, and like the first one is like be intentional about the change. Like, and I've said this to people, which is like you can quit your job and do whatever you want, right? Like if your job is making you unhappy or you want to change, quit your job, but be really intentional about the next step that you're making. And if you want to just try something random, that's okay, but be intentional about that too. Like don't fool yourself into thinking like, oh, I'm trying this random thing and it'll be like meaningful. Let yourself just have that random moment and have fun. I also feel like I'm harping on this a lot, but like do your due diligence. I feel like that to me, they say money doesn't buy happiness. I happen to think it buys you things that makes you happy. And so I would say like, to me, that gave me a lot of confidence in making the decision, was knowing that like I would still be able to do the things that I loved outside of work, and then my work would support me in that. So yeah, be intentional though.
Yeah.
Is I think a big part of it. Right. And I think a lot of that is just like this sounds so boring, but like sitting and thinking about what you want, and like really thinking about it outside of and this is hard, like outside of the confines of like what society and other people want from you, right?
Yeah. I think that's very real. I think that's the boring stuff is the important stuff. Like making that spreadsheet, figuring out if you can make this work, figuring out what it is that you actually want versus what other people have taught you to want or told you that you want. And that's the hard stuff. That's the hard work, I think. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about your approach to leadership, because in this role, when you moved over 3.5 years ago, this was the first time you were leading a team, and you mentioned that you were now leading people that were your friends and other people who were volunteers. Niharika, tell us a little bit about your leadership philosophy.
That makes it sound like I have a leadership philosophy, which, like, I'm so new to this, and I think I'm still, like, discovering parts of what this philosophy will be. So maybe have me back in a couple years, and I'll, like, have a better answer for you on this. But I would say that there's things that I've learned over time. So I think I always came in with, like, the idea of, like, I think it's called servant leadership or humble leadership. This one comes from my dad, because I saw him sort of do this as a leader in his workplace for many, many years. But I think this is almost even more true at a nonprofit. You never want to be the staff member who like sits in their ivory tower and is like commanding decisions and while like your volunteers execute. And I think Irene actually did this really well, where she was a volunteer for 3 years every Saturday simultaneously while being CEO, which is a lot to be clear. And so I think like that was always going to be a part of it. Now I think the tricky part of that is obviously as staff you have a different responsibility than volunteers. And so the thing that I'm probably trying to balance and learn right now is like, where is it meaningful for me to like lean into the servant leadership, and where is it meaningful for maybe me to pull back a little bit and sit a little bit more in the ivory tower? I don't know that I have a good answer for this, but it's just a thing that I think about of like, where can I most meaningfully spend my time? The other piece is actually a piece that you taught me. If you remember, many years ago when I actually started, I had texted you, I was like, Sara, how do I do this? And you had said something to me, which is like, I'm gonna like misquote you. But I think you had said something along the lines of like, always assume the best in people, but don't be afraid to give them feedback, like when they're not meeting your expectations. And I think
sounds like me.
Yeah, that was. I mean, and it's funny because you laugh, but like I've actually sent like a screenshot of your text to lots of different leaders on steering now, because I think like that is, especially as a volunteer leader, like I think you feel bad giving volunteers feedback. You're like, this is not your day job. Like, why would I give you feedback on how to improve? But I actually think that's really important because, and you had said this too, is like people know when they're not meeting your expectations. And so you're not doing any favors to anyone by like ignoring it. You might as well have that conversation. And there's ways to do that like empathetically and nicely, right? Like don't be a jerk about it. But I think like not totally a great answer or a succinct answer to your leadership philosophy question, but I think the big part of it is how to be more people focused and like how to really help people achieve the best that they can in this role and in the capacity that they have. I think that's been a big part of my learning, at least for the last like 2.5 years, 3 years, almost 3 years, sorry.
Yeah. Give yourself more credit. One of the things that I do remember about you is the way that you managed the instruction part of the program while I was there. And I mean, I think Vanessa and I at one point were like, I remember it was like the beginning of the school year, and both of us were like, "You see her? She's gonna be on steering. We're gonna have to recruit her on steering." And we were both like, "Yeah, Niharika," because we saw that in you. We saw that the way that you managed a lot of leadership. I think people think a lot of leadership is like being like up here and telling people like what to do and organizing like people and stuff. A lot of it is actually like, to your point, being with the people and understanding what their day is like and what their work is like and what their life is like, so you can help them kind of bridge gaps and connect the dots and inspire them and motivate them, but then also do like the structural stuff. Like you manage the instruction program so well, which is why I think you really stood out as a leader.
Thanks.
And that's why that was the real reason we recruited you into steering.
Yeah. Do you like that? You also did have to interview me. I remember that interview because that was we like got rid of these, but I remember like walking into my steering interview and it was you and Vanessa. You were obviously two people that I really looked up to, and I was like, oh man, they're gonna like not even hire me onto this team. But you did, so thanks.
Vanessa and I, if we call you in for an interview, you're already hired. Just so you know, you're already hired.
Pro tip.
Yeah, pro tip. No, we were truly very impressed with the way that you just showed up. Like I said, the way that you showed up, the way that you carried yourself, and everyone was like, "Oh, Niharika's so reliable and so dependable, and she's always there and she's always present." And I think that says a lot.
Thank you.
A good reputation.
Thank you. It's all downhill from here. I'm just kidding.
Niharika, where does your sense of purpose come from? And how does what you do contribute to your sense of purpose? Are the two connected?
I would say that they're definitely connected. I think what is your sense of purpose? Where does your sense of purpose come from? I think these are still questions that I'm trying to figure out. I don't know that I have a great answer. But I do think that, whatever that answer ends up being, I think there's some aspect of like serving people as part of my purpose. I think this is also true at Airbnb. I think if you look at a lot of the roles that I took on the infrastructure teams, you serve other engineers. So I think there is a like common through line in that. And so I think that's where my sense of purpose comes from. But and obviously, what I do now, it is very connected, right? Like our mission, the mission of Minds Matter is to serve our students and serve our community. And then obviously the staff member, you're serving the students, you're serving the community, you're also serving your volunteers and your volunteer leaders. And so I think they're definitely connected. And I think that's probably a good thing too, because I think about it in the other way, which is, it is true that all of us probably experience burnout at our jobs at some point. But I think what has kept me going, even through burnout at Minds Matter, has been that sense of purpose of being like, yes, today is really hard. Yes, this week is really hard. Yes, this thing is really hard. But there is something larger going on, which is like you're serving your people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very real, being able to connect what you're doing today to how it serves someone or a community or people or the world in the future. And I think it helps you keep going on those really hard days.
Yeah.
Niharika, you are one of 3 full-time staff members at Minds Matter, at Minds Matter Bay. What is the hardest part about being in an organization with lots of volunteers and being one of the 3 full-time staff members and leading those volunteers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are a couple of things that I think are really challenging. So one of the things is, so you remember, we hired Irene in 2019. I was hired in 2022. And then Janice, our third coworker, was hired in 2023. So this evolution of staff is actually quite new. And so I think one of the hardest parts right now actually is just like trying to balance the line of like, what do volunteers do versus what does staff do? That line is actually evolving, and it's evolving in a couple of different ways. So I think year over year, we start to get a better idea of where the org has strong opinions about things versus like where there is room to explore. And so because of that, naturally, there are then some things where staff is like, okay, no, like you have to do it this way, or like we're going to own this because it needs to get done this way. And then, sometimes that can cause a little bit of conflict, right? Because people are like, well, we used to own this, like why does it have to get done this way? And all like very fair, right? I think a lot of people want like that clarity and that the clarity of like expectations in their role. Unfortunately, the only thing we can really offer them is transparency that there will not be a lack of clarity, or that there will be a lack of clarity rather. But I think that's been a little bit tricky. I will also say, we talked a little bit earlier about how so much of leadership is really like being with the people and like really understanding people and what they need from their roles to feel valued and like what kind of impact that they want to have. I think one of the hardest parts of leading volunteer teams is we only have our teams for 2 years, maybe. So to take a step back, the highest level volunteer leadership is steering. Steering is a 2-year term. And so every 2 years, I'm getting, 2 new people in that seat, and that's a relationship that you have to then rebuild. You might have a relationship with them outside of that role, but having a relationship, is at a different role than at the steering level, does come with its own challenges, especially because I think the transition to being volunteer leadership is really, really hard. So I think that's part of it. I will also say that every year we have certain members of steering step down, and so then your team dynamics change. And so then every year you're really sort of thinking about like, okay, who is going to play certain roles on my team, and like how do I as a leader then like backfill, or cover any gaps. So as an example, many years ago, if you remember Tiffany Lowe, she was really, really good at like sensing what the group needed and like bringing harmony into that group. when she stepped down, I don't know that there was really anybody who like took her spot directly. And so I think then it's your job as a leader to really figure out like where are there gaps and plug that in. And truthfully, like I think I could be doing a better job at this. But I think that might be like some of the hardest stuff is just like a lot of the team dynamic and people dynamic stuff. And then like the last really hard part is obviously volunteers, not your full-time job. And so a lot of the work that I actually do, and I think we do this as a staff team, is like, given that we know that we have limited hours, where's the highest use of time for our volunteers? And that isn't actually extra load, right? Because there's a lot of things that our volunteer leaders could be doing, but we really have to sit and think like, okay, yes, we could ask them to do this, but like, what are the other things that are going to get dropped?
Yeah, I think a lot of those challenges, what's interesting to me as I hear you speak about them is they're very, you can translate those to, any environment, especially as a leader. What are some of the more fulfilling, happy, exciting parts of being in your role?
I'm so glad you asked me that. Yeah. Because there's so many great things about leading volunteers. And I think, honestly, the biggest part of it is actually related to the challenges is that because I have to work with so many people, I also get the chance to, like, learn from so many people, right? And so over the years, I think I've just had a chance to learn from people who have been very different from me, but seeing how they approach problems and seeing the flair that they bring to the org has honestly been a lot of fun. And I think it's just like, to me, I'm just inspired by our volunteer leaders. I'm getting paid to do this. They are not getting paid to do this, and the amount of dedication and just the amount of cool things that they've done is incredible. I mean, we launched San Jose with a team of 4 volunteers, right? That is unheard of. Like, they went out to schools and like got people, got mentees to sign up. They went out to, corporate fairs to get volunteers to sign up. That is incredible. And then on the San Francisco side, right, we are running a very large program now. I think the largest we've been since pre-pandemic. And our volunteer leaders were like, let's come up with a field trip day. Let's do an in-person college fair. And I think that's just so cool. And so it's really interesting. I think what's the most rewarding part is seeing what a group of really passionate and like dedicated people can get accomplished. Because to be honest, like Minds Matter Bay wouldn't work if we didn't have our volunteers. And so it's been really, really cool to just see them grow the org. As staff, we're almost just like the stewards of everything else. But it's really our volunteers that do the bulk of the work.
Yeah. I think that's a testament to the magic that can happen when people feel like they're doing something with purpose and with meaning, and they're contributing in some way, because I feel the same way about Minds Matter. It's been such a big part of my career journey for 8 years being a volunteer, and there were times when it didn't make sense for me to, go from like Fremont to San Francisco to go volunteer. But the feeling you have at the end of the day where you're like, oh my gosh, like there's this impact I get to make. It's so unique. It's such a unique feeling. And I think that's why people show up and they volunteer and they do amazing things as volunteers.
I love that you said that, because I think one of the things that we always say at Minds Matter, and we keep calling back to this, is that there's really only 2 reasons people stay in a volunteer community. This is probably true of other communities as well, but in our context, it's a volunteer community. One, people want to feel like they're having an impact, that sense of purpose, right? Especially in a volunteer community, and nobody's coming 2 hours on a Saturday to feel like they've made no difference, right? Doesn't make any sense. And 2, you also have to like the people that you're doing this with, right? Again, same kind of reason, like, if you're showing up for 2 hours on a Saturday, you don't want to be surrounded by jerks. And what's interesting is, like, you can't have just one. You actually need both. You can't have impact without cool people, but cool people isn't sufficient enough if you don't feel like that there's an impact.
Yeah, that's very true, and I feel like Minds Matter has figured that out.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting is that, like, we're trying to figure out, especially as the org grows, the people side of things is actually really interesting. I think the purpose is almost always going to be there. I mean, we are a volunteer org, we have a strong mission. I would say that around the purpose side of things, I think a lot of it might be, we work with teenagers, and I think teenagers, especially at 15, can maybe take a little bit of time to open up to 2 strangers. So I think there might be some work maybe on the volunteer side to say, like, it's okay, like, you're still having an impact even if your teenagers aren't giving you a lot. But that side is a little bit easier to take care of. I think the people side is really interesting, actually, because as the org grows, you can imagine that, like, not everybody is going to know everybody else, right? Like it's just impossible to know. And if you look at steering, right, the eight people on steering are very, very close because, we sit and we do a lot of work together. We're actually genuinely friends with each other. We've built that relationship. And so the question is, how do you build that in other parts of the org without relying sort of the time commitment of steering or a volunteer leadership position? So I think we figured out some parts of it, but I think the people side is actually still the more interesting side. And again, that's almost the harder side too, because your people keep changing. So what people want keeps changing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the people side is always the hardest side.
No, that's true. Yeah, that's fair.
Niharika, what are some misconceptions do you think that people have about careers in the nonprofit space?
It's a good question. I don't know a ton of them because I'm still so new to the space, but I will say maybe a misconception that I had before going into this, I thought I would have to give up software engineering entirely. I was like, there's no tech in nonprofit. And that is surprisingly untrue. I've actually had a chance to bring, some of the software engineering side of things into Minds Matter. Now, obviously, we're not a software engineering firm, so it's not all the same. But I think that's been really interesting to see where there might be overlaps between different industries.
Yeah. I think transferable skills are a very real thing, being able to pick up a skill set and apply it somewhere else. And I think one of the things that makes you so amazing for this organization, for the role that you're in, is because as a COO of this nonprofit, you come into it with an engineering mindset, and you can start to look at where things aren't really working, where things can be done better, where things can be broken. And I've thought about your career and, kind of the path that you've taken. And in my mind, I was like, I bet you she still uses the engineering brain a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's really interesting, and we've talked about this, maybe there's a blog post in the future. What's been really interesting is there are certainly places where I think engineering can help. Certainly when you're thinking about scaling, I think when you're thinking about systems at large, thinking about where things might break and optimizing them. But what I think is actually more fascinating has been the places where actually I've had to take a step away from the engineering side. So I'll give a really good example of this because I've thought about this a lot because I used to oversee recruiting, as you know.
Not at Airbnb.
Oh, yes.
At Minds Matter, you oversaw recruiting as the chief community officer.
Chief community officer, and actually is my first year at Minds Matter full time, I was actually in charge of all recruiting, which was wild as a full-time staff.
Yeah.
One of our highest conversion techniques for recruiting at Minds Matter was this idea of coffee chats. So the idea was you could sign up to talk to somebody for 15 to 30 minutes, and then you would apply, or if you'd already applied, you would get. The next step would be an interview. But what we found was conversion from that was really high, over 50%. So over 50% of people who were doing a coffee chat were actually applying and then converting to volunteers, which is insane, very high. But also it's incredibly time consuming if you think about it, right? It's 30 minutes of a volunteer's time to have this conversation. So the engineering part of me would be there's gotta be a way to optimize that, right? Can we put the most commonly asked questions on the website, which we did? And can we do something else? Can we host a virtual info session? Can we host an in-person info session, right? There's gotta be a better way. And the answer is really there's not. And and I think I've had to come to accept that there is something special about a one-on-one conversation. Is it the most efficient in the traditional sense of efficiency? No. But has it been widely useful? Yes. So long story short, the engineering side, where the engineering brain can't help, has almost been more interesting than where the engineering principles can help.
Interesting. I would not have guessed that. And I think it might have something to do with, there's certain things we just really value so much, having someone who has the expertise of an engineer. You don't think about where it doesn't work.
Yeah, there's a lot of places it doesn't work. I would not trust software engineers with a lot of things. I would trust them for some things, not everything.
Got it. I think other software engineers might trust themselves with a lot of things.
That's true. I might get kicked out of the software engineering club after this one.
Something I'd like to start reframing a little bit is the guilt that comes with not having everything figured out when it comes to your career. Because I think there's so much pressure to always have the answer or the next move or like have that strategy. And if you do something today, if you invest your time, we look at it as investing time in order for something to happen in the future. So Niharika, is there anything that you've done in your career other than the volunteer role that turned into a full-time job? Are there other things that you've done where you didn't really know where it would lead to, but you did it because maybe you found it interesting or fun, and then it actually resulted in something that was really good for your career?
Yes. So this was Airbnb. Back in the day, years ago, we used to have a volunteer global on-call rotation. So this was a group of like 29 people that were basically responsible for keeping the site up as volunteers. So I actually joined that. And, you know, I didn't really join it thinking that it would give me anything more than just like learning about the site. I was genuinely curious. This was, again, when I was on data infrastructure, so I didn't really know how the rest of the website worked, and I wanted to learn, so I was like, you know what, this seems fine. Like, I'll learn some stuff. Sure, I'll be on call. That'll be stressful. But what's really interesting is I did that for 1 year. I actually ended up leading it for the second year, and that actually really helped me in my next, when I jumped to the next team, because for two reasons. One, it ultimately like gave me a lot of knowledge and allowed me to figure out like which team I wanted to jump to next. And two, I actually made a lot of friends who were then ended up being on the team that I wanted to jump to. And I think that actually made it really successful because I was going to an entirely different org, needed to learn an entirely different skill set, but having friends who already knew me in a different context, but had also seen that I was like competent in a different context, I think that really helped. But I had no idea that was going to happen. Like when I joined, the volunteer on-call rotation was called SysOps. When I joined SysOps, like I had no idea that was going to be the team that I was going to jump to next. It was just kind of let me figure out how the whole site works.
Yeah, that happens so often in our lives where, you know, we're drawn to something and it's like something's calling to us. And I think when we think about it, we start to overanalyze and we start to go, oh, is that going to make sense for where I want to end up? And you actually, what I always tell people is like, you actually don't know where something might be leading you.
Yeah.
So like lean into that.
Yeah. I mean, you plant, like, I think we talk about this a lot, is like you plant a lot of seeds and like you never know which of the seeds are gonna like help. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that you just like don't plant seeds, right? Like at the end of the day, like you still have to try a bunch of new things. And it's okay to not know.
Yeah. What are some tools, tips, practices, resources that you have found really helpful in your own career that you can share with our listeners?
Yes, this is a good question. I would say, I don't know which of these it falls under, but I think for me, the thing that I probably found the most useful, the two things I found the most useful, three things, sorry. One, I think finding friends, right, or finding people that you can bounce these ideas off of, and like actually who genuinely, I think it's not about finding people who like think like you or don't think like you, but I think it's, you know, this is what I really value about you, Sara, right? Is that like you're just a very good listener and you have this ability to like ask questions that don't necessarily give you the answer, but help you think deeper about things. And I've been lucky enough to have a couple people like in my life that do that for me. And so I think that's been really helpful because when you're exploring, I think you don't necessarily want to be given the answer. You want to sort of come to that answer yourself, but I think you also need people who realize that like that's the role that they have to play. So find your people. But the other thing is, I think, and I said this a little bit earlier, it's like be intentional about the steps that you're taking, right? And again, like it can be for fun, like you don't have to always know, but if you're going to do something random, like also give yourself a time frame for the randomness and be like, okay, after X amount of time, and it can be a year, it can be 6 months, doesn't really matter, where you're going to reevaluate and say like, did this actually work? Like, is this going in the direction that I want it to go? And then I think for me personally, I'll call this out. I don't know that this is always applicable to everybody else, but I think the thing for me at like every point in the career that I think has really served me well and continues to serve me well actually at Minds Matter is figuring out like what I want to learn next and then putting myself in the places to be able to learn those things. I think that's been really, really helpful. But that also takes a lot of thought and being like, okay, because there's so many things you could learn. It's like, how do you figure out like what's the next one that you want to learn?
How do you figure out what's the next one you want to learn?
I sit and think about it for a long time. And I think some of that also like comes to me, right? Like I'll see a volunteer leader doing something really cool and I'm like, okay, how did you know? And I'll ask them like, how did you know to do this, right? Or like, why did you do this? I ask people a lot, like, what was your thought process? it's really funny. I make the joke that your brain is a giant machine learning model. It's like, how do you train the model? So I'll ask a lot of people, like, how did you get to this? Or why are you doing this? And then if there's repeated patterns of like people doing things that I'm like, oh, I never would have thought to do that. It's like, okay, maybe this is an area that I can learn from.
What are you working on learning right now?
I think a lot of it is still the people and like the team dynamics side of things. I think what I'm trying to figure out right now. So I'm naturally an extrovert, as you know, but I happen to have a few introverts on my team, and so I'm trying to figure out like how do I build. I'm sure a lot of people struggle with this. Is like how do I build an inclusive team environment where my introverts can also shine, understanding that like they may not show up to meetings in the same way that my extroverts do. So I think a lot of it is still just like the people and like the team dynamics. And the other part that I'm really working on is how do I very quickly identify what people are passionate about and then putting them in those spots to like actually go after their what they're passionate about. So I think like as an example, like I think there's some people on my leadership team who are very passionate about like intentionally trying new things, right? So they're not the people that you go to be like, let's have an open brainstorming session about like all of the new things that we could try. But I know how to deal with that. And so, you know, you're just very selective about the things that you ask them to like develop, or they'll come to you with things to develop. On the other hand, I think there are some people on my team who are like, we don't want to try new things. Like you tell us what to do and like we will optimize and execute the shit out of it. We will optimize and execute a lot of the things out of it. Sorry.
It's okay. You can say shit.
Okay. And so I think, and so that's, you know, I understand that and I can sort of identify that. But it's for some of the other people where like, especially if they're a little bit more, I think a little more hesitant to speak up for what they might need. I'm trying to get better at just like identifying like what is it actually that you need, and then how can I best serve you, right? And how can I best support you? It's a lot of trial and error. So I'm also learning how to have a thicker skin.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like you're on your way to learning about the people piece of it. When we started this conversation, and I don't know if this part was recorded, but you started with like, Sara, how the heck are you choosing people of like people who you're going to interview? And my funny answer was, well, I'm just trying to figure out what my friends do for a living. Right? But Niharika, it's actually because when I thought back to when I was starting my podcast, which a year ago, if you would have asked me if I was going to have a podcast, I would have laughed. But when I was starting it, I was like, okay, who are the people, like what this is going to be about work, and it's going to be about professional life, and it's going to be about how we figure it out. Who are the people that I've personally found very inspiring? And who are the people that have impacted my career journey, or who are the people who I feel like have something valuable to share with the world? I want to be able to speak to those people. So just so you know, that's why you're here.
Well, thanks. I definitely just hit the mic. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and sharing your journey. I think you have one of the coolest career stories.
Thank you.
And I don't know what, nobody knows what any of the moves that we make result in and how they where they take us. But I have a feeling that you're making some really well-informed, intentional moves, and I think I think your career is gonna end up in a really cool place, and I can't wait to continue to watch it.
Oh. Why, thank you. It's been an honor, Sara. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Can I add one last thing?
Yeah,
before
absolutely.
We close? I will say this. I think the one thing that's also probably served me well is once you make a decision, you can't undo it, right? And so once I made the decision to be at Minds Matter, you almost have to throw yourself into it. And even if you regret it, right? Like, I do not regret my decision to join Minds Matter. But if you do regret it, right? Like, I think it's just taking everything as a learning opportunity, right? And saying, like, I don't have to be here forever, right? Like, I can change. I think that's also served me well.
I think that's really important because I think a lot of the times we think we're going to make a career move, and it's like, oh my gosh, like that's it. Like we can't get ourselves to think beyond that sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's so important to like zoom out. And this is what I always tell my clients, and I tell people, I'm like, well, just zoom out and think about this as the next step, not the final step. And so who knows where it's going to lead.
It's so funny you said that. So I just started out my career, and I was really, really upset that I didn't get promoted one cycle. I don't remember what cycle it was. Like, I just didn't get promoted, and I was really upset about it. And I remember, somebody who would eventually become my skip level manager, I very much so respect him. He told me, he was like, listen, your career is going to be like, what, 40 years, 50 years, right? Some number of years. Getting promoted 6 months later than you expected is like such a blip. It feels really big right now. And of course, like, you don't want to say like, oh, it doesn't feel big. Like, why are you worried about it? It is a big thing. Like, feel your feelings, but also know that like everything is just like one step in a very long journey. And there's no reason to necessarily like feel like you have to skip a bunch of the steps.
Yeah, so true. Do you have any other career advice, any tips, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think I've said a lot.
Yeah.
So probably not. Listen to Sara whenever you can. Sara has served me very well in my career, so maybe that's my last advice is continue listening to this podcast because Sara is probably one of the most talented leaders that I think I've had a chance to see who really cares about her people, and ultimately, like, I think that's what makes a difference for all of our teams.
Oh, thank you so much, Niharika.
You're
That's so sweet.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. For our listeners, if they're, wondering where can they follow your work, your journey, where can they maybe find you or volunteer with you, tell us about that.
If you are curious about what I do, we have a website, so www.mindsmatterbayarea.org. That's probably the best way to keep track of what we're working on. We also have a LinkedIn, Minds Matter Bay Area, so I would follow us there.
Yeah, and if you're in the Bay Area, I highly recommend volunteering for Minds Matter. It is an amazing organization that's making a huge impact, and you've got great leaders like Niharika there. So,
and we could always use more. No, it is a wonderful thing, and I think one of the things we were talking about again with people, right, is it's been really interesting actually to see the shift, because while I do not oversee recruiting at Minds Matter anymore, I do still interview people, honestly, for fun, so that I can learn more about why people choose to join Minds Matter. And the big thing that I've heard people say is community. Yeah. They are working their corporate job. It might be remote, it might be hybrid, but they're looking for people like them with a sense of purpose, and they come to Minds Matter. So if that sounds like you, come join us.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
It was, wasn't it? I mean, I think we have a lot of really great conversations.